Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today, we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 11th of Jan 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now, these two articles appear on page number 1 as well as page number 13. These articles shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. These articles have appeared in the newspaper in the context of the meeting of the GST Council which took place yesterday. The outcome of this particular meeting was eagerly awaited since it was the last meeting of the GST Council before the Union Budget 2019. In this particular meeting, the GST Council has taken certain important decisions for the benefit of the small businesses. Hence, in this regard, let us understand some important decisions taken in the GST Council meeting. In this particular meeting, the GST Council mainly took three important decisions. The first important decision of the GST Council was with respect to the increasing the threshold on the annual turnover of a company for its compulsory registration under the GST regime. For example, earlier, if a company is located in northeastern part of India or in other hilly states, and if its annual turnover was greater than 10 lakhs, then such particular company was required to compulsorily register under the GST regime. However, this particular threshold on the annual turnover for the northeastern and hilly states has now got doubled to rupees 20 lakhs. Similarly, for a company located in the rest of India, earlier the threshold limit was rupees 20 lakh and now this threshold limit has got doubled to rupees 40 lakhs, which means that earlier all the companies which had an annual turnover of more than rupees 20 lakhs had to be compulsorily registered under the GST regime. However, now this particular limit has now got increased to rupees 40 lakhs, meaning that all the companies which have an annual turnover greater than 40 lakhs have to get registered, and the companies whose turnover is less than 40 lakhs need not go for the compulsory GST registration. The second important decision of the GST Council is with respect to the composition scheme. It is to be noted here that the composition scheme was introduced by the government for the benefit of the small and medium enterprises. Now, with respect to composition scheme, the GST Council has now decided to increase the annual turnover threshold of a particular company in order to avail the benefits under the composition scheme. Similarly, now the GST Council has brought even the small service providers into its ambit. Earlier, only the manufacturers and the traders were under the composition scheme. And lastly, because of the recent floods in Kerala, the Kerala government was facing shortage of funds in order to undertake the relief and rehabilitation works. Hence, in this regard, the government of Kerala had been demanding the GST Council to enable it to impose a GST cess. Now, this particular demand of the Kerala government has now got accepted by the GST Council. Hence, as part of this video analysis, firstly we'll understand as to what exactly is the composition scheme and what changes have been made to this composition scheme by the GST Council. And secondly, we'll look into this particular aspect of the GST cess which would be imposed by the government of Kerala. Now, coming to the composition scheme here, usually the micro, small and medium enterprises face difficulties in submitting frequent tax returns to the government, because of which their compliance cost increases. Further, these small-scale industries may not be in a position to maintain detailed account statement in order to file the tax returns. Hence, in order to simplify the tax compliance and to reduce the tax burden, the Government of India has introduced the composition scheme, wherein this particular scheme provides for a easy, low procedure and compliance-friendly tax scheme. And this is considered to be low procedure because the small-scale industries would not be required to maintain a detailed record keeping for the payment of taxes. This is because the small-scale industries would be required to pay a fixed percentage of their annual turnover as a tax. Hence, the main rationale behind the introduction of the composition scheme is to reduce the tax burden and to simplify the tax compliance of the small-scale industries. So the question here is, who can opt for the composition scheme? Now earlier, the composition scheme could be opted by the manufacturer of the goods, the traders, as well as the restaurants which are not serving alcohol. And the threshold on their annual turnover was less than 1 crore. Now what this means is, all these entities whose annual turnover was less than 1 crore could opt for the composition scheme. However, the GST Council has now expanded the ambit of the composition scheme to even include the service providers. So, apart from the manufacturers, traders, and restaurants, even the service providers can also opt for the composition scheme. Apart from this particular change, a change has also taken place with respect to the threshold on the annual turnover. Now, the annual turnover for the manufacturers, traders, and the restaurants to be included under the composition scheme was less than 1 crore. Now, the GST Council has now decided to increase this annual turnover for these three entities to rupees 1.5 crores. And with respect to service providers, for the service providers, the annual turnover shall be less than 50 lakhs. So all the service providers whose annual turnover is less than 50 lakhs can opt for the composition scheme. However, the manufacturer of goods, the traders, as well as the restaurants whose annual turnover is less than 1.5 crores can opt for the composition scheme. Further, as we have discussed, under the composition scheme, the small scale enterprises would be required to pay a fixed percentage of their annual turnover as the tax. Hence, in this regard, for the manufacturers and traders, the present tax rate applicable is 1%, which means that the manufacturers and traders would be required to pay 1% of their annual turnover as a GST. With respect to restaurants, the tax rate is 5%, and for the small service providers which are now included under the composition scheme, the tax rate applicable is 6%. So what benefits does the small scale enterprises get under the composition scheme? The first benefit is the small enterprises are required to pay less amount of tax, hence their tax liability reduces. Secondly, these small enterprises would not be required to maintain a detailed records, hence their compliance cost would also reduce. And finally, since the small enterprises pay a fixed percentage of their annual turnover as a GST, it significantly reduces the administration cost of the tax administration. Hence, these are some of the benefits of the composition scheme. The second important decision which has been taken by the GST Council is that it has enabled the government of Kerala to impose the GST cess in order to meet its expenditure for the relief and rehabilitation works. Now, this particular aspect of the demand of the Kerala government for the imposition of cess on the GST has been comprehensively been covered in our DNS dated 21st of October 2018. Apart from this, we have also covered the present financial architecture for the disasters, wherein we have discussed about the National Disaster Response Fund as well as the State Disaster Response Fund. Hence, I request you to go through this particular DNS dated 21st of October 2018 to get a comprehensive picture with respect to imposition of cess on the GST. Apart from the recent decisions taken by the GST Council, one should also know the composition of the GST Council and, more importantly, how the GST Council makes important decisions. These aspects of the GST Council would be important for the upcoming prelims 2019. The GST Council has been created under Article 279A of the Indian Constitution. This has been provided under the 122nd Constitutional Amendment. Now, if you look at the composition of the GST Council, the GST Council is a federal body consisting of representation from both center as well as states, wherein the central government is represented by the Union Finance Minister, who also acts as the chairperson of the GST Council. Apart from the Union Finance Minister, even the Union Minister of State for Finance is also a member of the GST Council. And if you look at the representation of the states, every state government is represented by either the Finance Minister or any other minister nominated by the state government. With respect to the voting in the GST Council, the central government has a total weighted votes of one-third, whereas all the states put together have a total weighted votes of two-third. So the central government has a total weightage of almost 33%, whereas remaining 67% of the votes is held together combinedly by all the states. In this regard, Article 279A provides that every decision of the GST Council has to be taken by a majority of not less than three-fourths of the total votes. Now, three-fourths of the total votes here approximately corresponds to the 75% of the votes. So you can clearly see here the central government has approximately 33% of the votes. All the state governments put together have 67% of the votes. And in order to take any major policy decision, a minimum of 75% of the votes have to concur with the decision. Now, these aspects of the GST Council become important mainly from the perspective of prelims. Based upon the discussion which we had so far, these two questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answer to this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to the composition scheme. The first statement is, this scheme provides for a easy, low procedure and compliance friendly tax scheme for all the firms. Now this particular statement here is wrong because the composition scheme is applicable to only some of the firms whose annual turnover is less than 1.5 crores. The second statement reads as, this scheme provides for the payment of GST in terms of fixed percentage of the profits of the firms. Now even this particular statement here is wrong. This is because under the composition scheme, the firms would be required to pay GST in terms of fixed percentage of their annual turnover and not in terms of the fixed percentage of their profits. And if you read the statement here, the statement reads, which of the statements given above is or are incorrect. So looking at the options here, both the statements are incorrect. Hence the answer to this question is C. That is both 1 and 2. Now the second question here is, consider the following statements related to the GST Council. The first statement is, it is headed by Prime Minister, which is wrong. This is because the GST Council is headed by the Finance Minister. The second statement reads as, the centre has a weightage of 2/3 votes while the states have a combined weightage of the remaining 1/3 votes. Now here this particular statement is wrong because the states have a combined weightage of the 2/3 votes whereas the centre has a weightage of 1/3 votes. The third statement reads as, the decision of the GST Council has to be ratified by minimum 3/4 of the total weighted votes of the members. As we have discussed, the statement here is correct. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is C, that is 3 only. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 8. The title of the article is, Let the Grassroots Breathe. This article has appeared in the newspaper because the recently elected government in Rajasthan has scrapped the minimum educational requirements for the candidates contesting the local body elections. The article here highlights that this particular move of the Rajasthan government is quite good, since the educational criteria for contesting elections to the local bodies would prevent the marginalized sections from contesting elections. Apart from that, it will also prevent the local bodies from becoming truly representative institutions. Hence, in this regard, this article becomes important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Governance. Apart from that, this article is also important because in UPSC Mains 2015, a related question on the Panchayati Raj institution has already been asked. And an expected UPSC Mains question from this article could be, imposition of educational criteria for contesting elections to the local bodies would go against the spirit of democratic decentralization. Discuss. The Parliament of India had passed the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act in the year 1992, wherein the 73rd Constitutional Amendment provided for the constitutional status to the Panchayati Raj institutions, whereas the 74th Amendment Act provided for the constitutional status to the urban local bodies. Now, the rationale behind the Parliament to provide the constitutional status to these local bodies was mainly twofold. Firstly, the Parliament wanted to empower the people at the grassroots by bringing in a genuine democratic decentralization, which means that by creation of local bodies, the Parliament wanted to transfer the powers from the centre and the states to the local bodies. And the idea here was to empower the people. And the second objective of passage of this particular act was to deepen the social and political democracy in India. And this social and political democracy is possible by providing reservation for the marginalized section of the Indian society. For example, under the 73rd and 74th Amendment Act, a minimum of 33% of the seats have to be reserved for the women. Similarly, it also provides for the reservation in the favor of SCs and STs in accordance to their population. Hence, the idea behind the 73rd and 74th Amendment Act was to bring in a democratic decentralization and to deepen the social and political democracy. But the question which can be raised here is, should there be educational qualifications for the people who want to contest the local body elections? Now, this particular question here is highly debatable. This is because if we impose educational qualifications on the people contesting elections to the local bodies, this would improve the administration of local bodies. This is based upon an assumption that a person who is well educated would also have a necessary skills for undertaking the administration. Secondly, imposition of educational qualification would incentivize the people to get educated. Similarly, the families would be incentivized to provide education to their children. More importantly, they will be incentivized to provide education to the girl child. Hence, the educational qualification for contesting local body elections can be considered to be a tool to promote education in India. However, one concern which can be raised here with respect to educational qualification is that it would violate the fundamental right to equality. This is because the fundamental right to equality states that the state shall not discriminate against its citizens on the grounds of religion, caste, sex, or place of birth. But what are we doing here is that by laying down the educational qualification as a prerequisite to contest the local body elections, we are enabling only the educated people to contest elections and preventing the uneducated from contesting elections. And this would go against right to equality. However, when the state government of Rajasthan and Haryana imposed the educational qualification as a criteria for contesting elections, the Supreme Court, in the famous case known as the Rajbala versus Haryana, ruled that the imposition of educational qualification does not violate the right to equality. And the Supreme Court was of opinion that the educational qualification would lead to an improvement in the overall administration of the local bodies. So, looking at these 3 points, one can come to a conclusion that the imposition of educational qualification for contesting elections to the local bodies is desirable. However, one should also note that there is a other side of this particular debate as well, wherein imposition of educational qualifications would prove to be detriment for the marginalized sections as well as the local bodies. Now, this is because by laying down educational qualification, we would be preventing the marginalized section of the Indian society, such as the women, SCs, and STs, from contesting the elections. This is because if one looks at the literacy rate of these marginalized sections, the literacy rate is quite poor. Hence, by laying down educational qualification as a criteria for contesting elections, we would be preventing them from contesting elections, and this would go against the spirit of ushering in the social and political democracy. Secondly, it is the state here which has failed to provide education to its citizens. So the question which can be raised here is, why should the marginalized section of the Indian society be penalized for the failure of the state to provide them the education? And lastly, it can also be argued as to why should the local bodies be singled out for laying down the educational qualifications, particularly when such educational qualifications are not required for contesting elections to the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So, as you can see here, laying down minimum educational qualifications for contesting elections to local bodies has both pros as well as cons, and it is highly debatable. In this regard, this particular article here suggests that imposition of educational qualifications for contesting elections to the local bodies would go against the constitutionally stated objectives of bringing in a democratic decentralization and to deepen the social and political democracy. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Now these two questions here shall be a prelims question for the practice. It is to be noted that these aspects may not have been covered in the discussion which we had so far because of the limited scope of the article. Nevertheless, these aspects of the local bodies are important from the perspective of prelims. So please pause this video and try to find answer to these questions. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The first question here is, consider the following statements related to the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act. The first statement here is, it provides for minimum reservation of 33% for the women in the Panchayati Raj institutions. As we have discussed here, this particular statement is correct. The second statement reads as, it provides for a mandatory reservation in the favor of OBCs in the Panchayati Raj institutions in accordance to their population. Now, if you look at the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act, it provides for the mandatory reservation of 33% for the women and a mandatory reservation for the SCs and STs in accordance to their population. However, with respect to the reservation for the OBCs, the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act does not make it mandatory for the states to have a reservation for the OBCs. However, the 73rd Amendment Act states that the state legislatures may provide for the reservation in the favor of OBCs, which means that it is not mandatory, rather, it is left to the discretion of the state legislature. Hence, in this regard, only statement number 1 is correct. So, the correct answer to this question is A, that is 1 only. Now, coming to second question here, the question is, which among the following are set up under the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act? Here it is to be noted that the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act contains the articles from Article 243P to Article 243ZG, wherein the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act provides for 3 types of urban local bodies, namely Municipal Council for the smaller urban areas, Municipal Corporation for the larger urban areas, and the Nagar Panchayat for the areas in transition. So if you look at the options here, the first option is District Planning Committee. The District Planning Committee has been provided under Article 243ZD, which is part of the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. Similarly, the Metropolitan Planning Committee has been provided under Article 243ZE, which is also part of the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. And lastly, the Nagar Panchayat. And as we have discussed, the Nagar Panchayat is for the management of the areas which are in transition. So all these 3 bodies are created under the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is D, that is 1, 2 and 3. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now, this particular article appears as a lead article on page number 8. The title of the article is A Solution in a Search of a Problem. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance. Recently, the Parliament passed the Constitutional Amendment Bill for providing 10% reservation for the economically weaker section of the Indian society. In this regard, this particular lead article here seeks to evaluate the problems associated with the reservation for the economically weaker sections. And because of the problems, this lead article provides certain possible alternatives. Hence, as part of this video analysis, firstly we'll understand as to what problems this particular article has highlighted with respect to reservation for the economically weaker sections. And secondly, we'll look into the possible alternatives highlighted in the article. Now, the first concern raised in this article is that the government's proposal to provide for 10% reservation for the economically weaker section would actually end up giving reservation for the 95% of the households in India. This is because, as per the bill, the government intends to provide reservation for those households whose annual income is less than rupees 8 lakhs. But if you look at the present situation in India, most of the households have their annual income less than 8 lakhs. For example, if you look at the survey carried out by the National Sample Survey Organization in the year 2011-12, 99% of the households have their annual income less than 8 lakhs. Similarly, if you look at the data presented by India Human Development Survey, this data also shows that 98% of the households in India have their annual income less than 8 lakhs. Further, apart from the income criteria, the reservation would also be provided based upon other indicators such as the amount of land held by a family as well as the size of the house. Now, this particular article here suggests that even if you take these factors into account, we would end up providing reservation for 95% of the households in India. In this regard, this particular article here raises a very valid point as to whom are we actually excluding. since a majority of the households would automatically be covered under this particular reservation. Hence, in this regard, this article highlights that even though the bill provides for reservation only for the economically weaker section, it would end up giving reservation to 95% of the households, and thus it would not be able to exclude the majority chunk of the population. The second concern raised in this article is that the quota bill would go against the interest of the vulnerable sections such as the SCs, STs, and OBCs. This is because after the quota bill, these sections would have reduced opportunities. So the question here is, how come the quota bill would reduce the opportunities for the vulnerable sections? It is to be noted that these vulnerable sections, that is SCs, STs, and OBCs, can claim reservations not only in their own category, but they can also claim reservation under the general category. So earlier, these vulnerable sections were able to claim reservation even within the 50% reservation provided for the general category. However, the Constitutional Amendment Bill has now separately earmarked 10% of these general category seats for the economically weaker sections. Hence, these vulnerable sections would now have to claim reservation only within the remaining 40% of the seats which are now reserved for the general category. Hence, in this regard, this particular article suggests that the passage of the quota bill would lead to reduced opportunities for the vulnerable sections such as SCs, STs, and OBCs. Apart from this, this particular article also highlights that the passage of the reservation bill would lead to increased demand for the reservation by the OBCs. Because even though the OBCs comprise of 40% of the India's population, the amount of reservation which is provided to the OBCs is only 27%. Hence, in this regard, this article cautions that the passage of the quota bill would lead to increase in the demand for the reservation by the OBCs. The third concern raised in this article is that the passage of the quota bill goes against the need for India to have a specialized skill set in different fields. Let's understand this by an example. Suppose, say, a public sector undertaking advertises for a post of a scientist which has been reserved for a person belonging to the economically weaker section. And let's say a suitable candidate from the economically weaker section to fill up this particular post is not available. Now, in this particular case, this particular PSU would not be able to hire a suitable candidate from the OBC since this particular post here has been earmarked only for the economically weaker section. Hence, with the growing advancement in the technology, India needs specialized skill set, and this particular provision of providing quota may go against India's requirement. The last concern raised in this article is with respect to implementation of the reservation for the economically weaker section. Now, as we have seen, the Constitutional Amendment Bill intends to provide reservation based upon the income limit, the amount of land, or the size of the house. But the question is, how do we establish this economic criteria in a manner which is foolproof? Which means to say, it may be easier for the households to conceal their annual income or the amount of land held by them. It is because of these reasons the implementation of the reservation for the economically weaker sections may actually become challenging. So these are some of the concerns raised by the author in this particular article. Apart from these concerns, the author has also mentioned certain possible alternatives. So let us understand as to what possible alternatives the author has suggested in order to address these concerns with respect to reservation. Now, this particular article here suggests that even though the government is providing reservation for the vulnerable sections such as SCs, STs, and OBCs, such a reservation policy of the government has not benefited all the families of these vulnerable sections. This is because only some families of these vulnerable groups may have got benefit under the reservation. Now, this can be seen from the fact that a particular person belonging to the vulnerable section can avail the reservation benefits multiple times during his lifetime. For example, a person can claim a reserved seat in the prestigious College of India, and once this particular person passes out of this prestigious college, he can even apply for a government job to the reservation. So what is happening here is that a particular person is able to claim reservation benefits multiple times during his lifetime, wherein through the reservation he can even get a admission in a prestigious college as well as a government job. Now this is undoubtedly good because it will help this particular person as well as his family in the upward mobility. However, when this person is claiming reservation benefits multiple times, this would lead to reduced opportunities for the upward mobility of the people belonging to the reserved category. Hence, this particular article here highlights that only some families of the vulnerable sections have got benefited from the reservation policy. And even today, a majority chunk of the population belonging to vulnerable sections may not have got the benefit under the reservation policy. In this regard, this article suggests that the government should have to spread the benefits of reservation. And this can be done by ensuring that a person should be allowed to claim the reservation benefits only once in his lifetime. Now, this would ensure that this particular person is able to have an upward mobility, and once this particular person has an upward mobility, it will also give opportunities for the other persons or their families to have a upward mobility in the society. Now, coming to second strategy. Now, the basic philosophy behind the reservation policy has been to reduce the inequality. So, what have we done so far in order to reduce inequality? We have basically provided for the reservation for the vulnerable sections in the higher educational institutions. It is based upon an assumption that if people belonging to vulnerable sections get the best quality of education, then automatically an upward mobility would be able to take place. However, the article here suggests that this particular strategy, what we have adopted so far, is wrong, wherein instead of reducing the growing inequality in our country, we should be actually be striking at the roots of inequality. Now, this is because, according to the article, the inequality in India basically emerges from the kind of primary education which is being imparted. So, if you look at the performance of the candidates belonging to the general category and compare that performance with the student belonging to SC or ST category, normally the performance of the general category students in the primary education is quite higher than the performance of a SC/ST candidate. Now, this clearly shows that India has not placed adequate amount of emphasis on the primary education or its quality. So, this primarily shows that the quality of primary education which is being imparted in India, especially for the vulnerable sections, is quite poor. Hence, in this regard, this article suggests that instead of reducing the inequality by providing reservation in the higher educational institutions, India should instead strike at the roots of inequality by focusing on the quality of the primary education. So these are the two possible alternatives which have been highlighted by the author with respect to the reservation policy of the government. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now move to the next article. The next article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is Center Aims for 20% Cut in the Air Pollution by 2024. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Environment under the subsection Environmental Pollution. Recently, according to a leading medical journal known as Lancet, India has emerged as the topmost country in terms of number of deaths caused due to air pollution. So one can clearly see here that the air pollution has emerged as one of the biggest health hazards in India. It is in this particular regard the Government of India has launched a new program known as the National Clean Air Program. And the main objective of this particular program is to reduce the concentration of the particulate matter 2.5 and the particulate matter 10 by 20 to 30% by the end of 2024. And in order to achieve this particular objective, the National Clean Air Program seeks to increase the number of air quality monitoring stations across India. Apart from that, it also seeks to educate the common man with respect to prevention and the mitigation of air pollution. And under the National Clean Air Program, the Government of India has totally selected 102 cities. Now, these cities are those cities which have consistently shown a poor air quality. And all these 102 cities are required to come out with a city-specific action plan in order to prevent and mitigate the air pollution. And some of the actions which these cities are required to take include ensuring pothole-free roads in order to improve the traffic flow and reduce the air pollution. Second, to reduce the dust emanating from the construction-related activities, and to take strict action against any unauthorized brick industries. Now, this becomes important because the brick industries have contributed for the particulate matter. So, these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to National Clean Air Program. Now, the next article appears as an editorial on page number 8. The title of the article is Caution Ahead. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Economy, under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. Now, this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because the Central Statistical Organization, which measures the GDP in India, has recently released a report wherein it has tried to estimate the GDP growth rate for the current fiscal year 2018-19. And according to this particular report, the GDP is estimated to grow at the rate of 7.2% for the current fiscal. And this estimate for the GDP growth rate becomes important because the current estimated GDP growth rate for the current year is higher than the GDP growth rate achieved in the previous financial year 2017-18, wherein in 2017-18 India achieved a GDP growth rate of 6.7%, whereas according to CSO the GDP growth rate is projected to be 7.2% for the current year. This clearly shows that the GDP growth rate in India has actually improved. And this improvement in the GDP growth rate can be attributed to mainly two factors. So, if you look at the year 2017-18, the Indian economy faced the twin shocks of both demonetization as well as the GST. Now, because of the demonetization, the amount of currency circulation in the economy had drastically reduced, because of which it had affected the demand, leading to a reduced GDP growth rate. Similarly, the implementation of the GST faced certain challenges, because of which it also adversely affected the GDP growth rate in the short run. However, the year 2018-19 has shown a higher GDP growth rate than the previous financial year. This clearly shows that the Indian economy has been able to come out of the twin shocks of demonetization and the GST. Apart from that, the year 2018-19 has also seen a pickup in the investment rate, wherein according to CSO, the investment rate has increased to 33% of the GDP, which is considered to be the highest in the last 3 years. And as you know, the investment rate in a country is directly proportional to the GDP growth rate. Hence, as the investment rate increases, the GDP growth rate in India is also expected to increase. In spite of these bright spots before the Indian economy, this editorial here has also highlighted certain immediate concerns before the Indian economy. The main concern before the Indian economy is with respect to the fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit represents the total amount of government borrowings for a particular year, and this represents a very important indicator for the macroeconomic stability of India. However, if you look at the fiscal deficit presently in India, it is quite high. For example, for the financial year 2018-19, the government of India had laid down a target of reducing the fiscal deficit to 3.3% of the GDP. However, if you look at the present condition with respect to fiscal deficit, the government has already exceeded its borrowing target by almost 15% in the 8 months only. Now, this clearly shows that the government finances are in a precarious situation. Now, because of the present condition related to fiscal deficit, this editorial here raises concerns as to how would the government be able to reduce its fiscal deficit to 3.3% of the GDP. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 5. The title of the article is National Green Tribunal seeks report on interlinking of Andhra Pradesh rivers. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Current Events of National Importance. Now, this article has appeared in the newspaper because the National Green Tribunal has directed the Ministry of Environment and Forest to submit a report on the status of the Godavari, Krishna and Pennar river linkage within a month. Now, this particular aspect of the interlinking of the rivers has already been asked in the UPSC Prelims 2016. The question was, recently linking of which of the following rivers was undertaken? And as you can see here, the answer to this particular question is B, that is Godavari and Krishna. So if you look at the interlinking of the rivers in the state of Andhra Pradesh, this particular project seeks to link the Krishna river with the Godavari river. And one of the main component of this particular project is the Polavaram project, which has been declared as a project of national importance by the Union Cabinet. So the Polavaram project is a part of the Godavari river, whereas the Prakasam barrage here is part of the Krishna river. Apart from the interlinking of Godavari with the river Krishna, another important river linking project which is presently planned is the linking of the Ken river with the Betwa river in the state of Madhya Pradesh. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 13. The title of the article is RBI notifies the deferment of capital buffer norms as per the board's call. Now, this particular article basically states that the RBI has now issued a notification stating that the Basel III norms would be adopted by the Indian banks by the end of March 2020. Earlier, the deadline for meeting the Basel III norms was March 2019. It is to be noted that this particular decision to defer the implementation of the adoption of Basel III norms was recently undertaken by the RBI board. Now, this particular aspect of the Basel III norms and the capital adequacy ratio, as well as the issue related to the implementation of the Basel III norms, has been comprehensively been covered in our DNS dated 20th of November 2018. So please go through this particular DNS in order to understand about all the aspects related to this particular article. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now let us look at the question for the day.